Alright guys, so today I'm going to show you some watercolor examples from some very um, well-known, famous watercolor artists. So these are like masters of watercolor. So first, this is a watercolor titled Muddy Alligators by John Singer Sargent. John Singer Sargent is a very famous watercolor artist. He also did oil paintings, but I'm a really big fan of his watercolors. So if we take a look at this one, I'm just going to point out a few things that he does that makes this a very interesting piece. First of all, you might notice the contrast. So contrast is the difference between really bright areas and really dark areas. So you'll see some super dark areas and some super light areas next to them, especially in the alligators, the little scales and things like that. Creating that contrast really adds interest to the artwork. Also, the composition. So composition is how the overall picture looks and why it works well. So if you look at this one, he has the alligators on here with like kind of a center of interest right around here on this big alligator right here. So size is one way you can make like a center of interest. So the biggest alligator right here. Another thing that's helping kind of create a center of interest in his piece is these lines that swirl. You see like the bodies of the alligators kind of swirl around at this spot, and that's making you kind of focus right here. Another thing is how bright the alligator is in this middle area right here. It's got a lot of white on it, so your eye is drawn to it pretty quickly compared to the darker areas on the background. Another thing to notice is that even though this alligator is kind of the center of interest, it's not exactly dead center on the page. Putting what you want as like the focal point dead center on the page tends to not look quite as interesting as if you offset it from the center just a little bit. Okay, so these are a few the ways that John Singer Sargent has created an appealing composition. Another thing he's done to add interest to his piece is he's using complementary colors. So complementary colors are any two colors that are opposite of each other on the color wheel. So the complementary colors he's using right here, he's got lots of blue. So if you look at the shadows, it's blue. So if you look at a color wheel, right across from blue on the color wheel is going to be orange. So you've got all these cool shadows, blues on the alligators, and then the orange in the background. And that's creating even more contrast and making these alligators stand out even more from the background. Okay, so a few things about watercolor. So with watercolor, the way an artist creates a watercolor is they use different layers of like really transparent watercolor paints. And in order to do this and get all of this detail in here and all of the different layers, you start from the lightest layers first, and then you go to the darkest layers last. So all of the lightest colors are at the very bottom. And this is kind of opposite of what you would do in like an oil painting. In an oil painting, you would want all the darks at the back, so they're kind of like the bottom layer, and it creates an illusion of depth. But with watercolor, we need to have all of our lights on there first because we're using a lot of water mixing things on there. And so if we use a dark color somewhere first, and then we layer water back on top of it, that dark color is going to kind of bleed into whatever we're working on, and it could ruin all of our areas that we wanted to keep light. So watercolor is a lot of working really light stuff first, adding another layer of darker stuff on top of it, adding another layer of darker stuff on top of it, over and over and over until you build up the whole painting. So it's a lot of adding a light layer, letting it dry, and repeating that process over and over. And if you look at the really white areas, so like the backs of the alligators and things like that. The white actually comes from the white of the paper in a watercolor. There's not white. There is white watercolor paints, but they don't work very well. You need to use the white of the paper to get the really bright spots. So everywhere you see really, really bright spots on these alligators and on these trees and in the background, those are areas that the artist did not put any paint on. So all of that white's just coming from the paper underneath. Okay. Another thing you can see that John Singer Sargent does really well is he kind of uses a lot of different watercolor techniques. So some of this fuzzy stuff at the bottom, that's really making this cool reflection. The fuzziness of the alligator, kind of that out of focus looking areas, is a technique called wet and on wet. That's where you wet the paper first with water, just clean water, and then you drop paint onto that and let it kind of blend out. Now, if you look at areas like this where you've got like this grass right here, that is going to be like a dry brush technique. So that's where you try not to use very much water at all and just mostly paint, and you're kind of using that brush to create that texture on there. Okay? All right, let's look at another one of John Singer Sargent's paintings. So this one is called Ships. So if you look at this one, a couple things to think about is how many colors he's using. Okay, John Singer Sargent is very good at using a limited color palette. And so a limited color palette is when you just use just a few different colors and repeat them all over the painting, so that way you create like unity in your painting. Okay, it makes it all look like it goes together very well. Okay, so in this painting he's using lots of blues, this kind of like golden yellow and orange, and kind of just maybe a little bit of a green in there. Okay, so just 3 colors to create everything that he's making over here. And he may have used a little bit of black for parts of the boat too. So again, using just a few colors, he's creating something that looks really unified, really goes together. And again, he's using those complementary colors to create contrast. He's using blue and he's using orange. Okay, that's helping it look a little bit more dynamic and helping those boats kind of set themselves apart from the background a little bit more. It also really sets the mood of the whole painting and shows you like it kind of looks like it's like the sun might just be coming up and you've got that kind of golden dawn effect. Okay. Another thing to look at with this painting is how loose it is. A lot of times artists, when they're doing watercolors, it could be like a preliminary sketch for an oil painting. So it's really loose and just really big streaks of paint, brush strokes everywhere. And he's definitely used a lot of wet and wet on this one, where he's wet the page first and then really put some of this paint down. That's why you've got all these really cool colors starting to blend together down here. Okay, just keep those things in mind whenever we're working on our own watercolors, all of the different ways these watercolor techniques play together. Let's take a look at another one. So this one is another John Singer Sargent painting. This is called White Ox at Siena. So this one, again, look at the different things he's doing. Limited color palette. He's mostly using that blue and the orange, those complementary colors together, and a little bit of green. Again, he's leaving a lot of white on here for contrast and to really one of the most important things in a watercolor is leaving those whites. They can really add a lot of interest in your painting, and so John Singer Sargent was really good at leaving those areas of white in the right spots. And again, he was really good at keeping things really loose and blending things together really well. Okay, let's move on to another artist. No, it's still John Singer Sargent. Okay, this one is a house that he painted. It's called Light and Shadows. So you can see his main interest in this one was capturing those different colors that show up in the shadows. and the contrast between the light and the shadow from that tree, casting the shadow on this house. But notice he didn't use black in any of this. There's not a single drop of black. Sometimes it's much more interesting to use color in your shadows than it is to use black, and it really makes it look a little bit more lifelike and realistic. Right. Okay, so moving on to Mary White. Mary White is another very prolific watercolor artist. This one is titled Red Hat. Mary White does a lot of portraiture, so she likes to have people in her artwork quite a bit. But let's notice some of the things that Mary White did on this one. First of all, let's look at all the color choices. She's only using a few different colors in this as well. She's got like this kind of brownish red color. She's got like a blue that she's using underneath that you can see kind of peek through in different areas. And she's using the red. Everything else is kind of coming from those colors. Now you might think like this is black up here. She's actually mixing that blue and that red together to really kind of make that into like a really dark red. And so that's what those kind of dark areas are. It's that dark mixture like that. Another thing that Mary White is really good at is keeping hard edges in the right spots. With watercolor, it's easy to, go ahead and like add water everywhere, drop color in there and make things really, really soft. But you can also have more control of your brush and do a technique like either dry brush or wet on dry. So that's where you have wet paint going onto dry paper. Okay, and that can give you more control of these edges. Okay, so if you look, she's got hard edges all around the face. It makes the face really stand out, but then she gets really, really soft everywhere else. It's kind of like when a camera is slightly out of focus on everything but the subject, and she's created that effect through the watercolor. Another thing to keep in mind is all of the white spots, again, are areas that come from the white of the paper. So think about how difficult that could be with all of these little spots, like on her face, on the flowers, on her dress down here, even some of the texture on the wall. To maintain that, you have to be really careful with when you're starting to apply paint that you're not covering up any of those white spaces. You have to make sure that those are on your mind the entire time. And that's going to help you maintain some of those white areas and not lose them. Now there are techniques that you can use to kind of get back some of the white and lighten things up. There's a technique called lifting out, where you use a dry brush, a clean dry brush, and when your paint is still wet on the paper, you can just kind of soak up that water with your brush, clean it off, get more clean water on there, and keep repeating that process until it really lightens up. But you'll never get it completely white ever again if any of that paint touches those white areas. So you've got to be really careful. All right, let's take a look at another Mary White. So this one is called Blue Umbrella. Again, it's another portrait. This time, look at some of the effects she did with the white on the paper. Again, limited color palette. So she's using blue and yellow, and then maybe like a little bit of like a burnt sienna brownish color for the skin tones. And she does blend some of that color back into the background and into the dress. So that's important because if you look at any section if you split this into like 4 areas and you look at any one of those sections, you're going to see all of those colors in every single one of those sections. And that is the sign of an artist that knows what they're doing, because they're repeating their color. It's called color repetition. And that, again, helps create a more unified picture overall.